This is the email I should have never opened. The subject line alone made my stomach tighten before I even clicked it. Welcome family retreat schedule Bennett Beach Villa. 3 days. 15 guests confirmed. My name is Laura Bennett, and for a full 10 seconds I just stared at my screen without blinking, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less impossible. They didn't they? The email was real. The sender was my mother, Patricia Harlow. And the attachment below it was even worse. A detailed plan of how my beachfront villa in Florida was going to be used for a 3-day family getaway starting next Friday. Rome assignments. Meal schedules. Even a grocery list split between relatives like this was a hotel reservation already approved. I remember slowly setting my phone down on the kitchen counter, the silence of my house suddenly feeling heavier than it had any right to be. My beach villa in Palm Coast wasn't just property to me. I had bought it 5 years ago after years of working double shifts in accounting, saving every bonus, every tax return, every extra dollar I could set aside. No help. No inheritance. Just me and a mortgage I paid down early because I refused to carry debt into the next chapter of my life. And yet somehow, in my mother's mind, it had become something else entirely. A shared family asset. A place she could assign like seating at a wedding. I opened the attachment again, hoping I had misunderstood something. 15 relatives. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. 2 uncles who barely called. Even my Aunt Denise, who once told me I was too independent for my own good like it was a flaw rather than survival. And then I saw the note at the bottom, written in my mother's familiar tone, casual and confident, as if she were organizing a picnic instead of taking over Someone's private home. Laura will be so happy to host us all. She always has space. I let out a small breath I didn't realize I was holding. It wasn't the anger yet. Not exactly. It was something colder, quieter, like my mind refusing to accept information that didn't fit the reality I had built. I walked toward the sliding glass doors that opened into my backyard, where I could see the faint outline of the ocean beyond the dunes. The house was quiet. Though quiet for what my mother had just scheduled inside it. I thought about the last conversation we had, just a week ago. She had asked casually, almost absent-mindedly, when I would be using the beach house less because, in her words, family should make better use of something so big. At the time I laughed it off. I thought she meant a weekend visit. Maybe a dinner. I didn't think she meant 15 people arriving with luggage and expectations like I had turned my home into a resort. My phone buzzed again. A second message from her. I already told everyone you're excited. Don't worry, we help with everything. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet recognition that what I was looking at wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision made without me. I placed my hand on the cool glass of the door and stared out at the horizon, trying to make sense of how long this had been building without me noticing. The villa was mine. My name was on every document, every bill, every insurance policy. But somewhere in my Famyly's version of reality, ownership had become optional, something that could be overridden by confidence and repetition. And as I stood there, watching the waves roll in without interruption, I realized this wasn't just about a vacation plan. It was about something much older, something I had ignored for far too long, the belief that what belonged to me could still be negotiated away in the name of family. After I put the phone down, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of waves beyond my backyard. Nothing in the house had changed, but everything felt different, like the walls had quietly shifted while I was not looking. The email was still open on my tablet, the schedule glowing softly on the screen, as if waiting for me to accept it simply because it existed. I scrolled through it again, slower this time, noticing details I had missed in my first shock. My mother had not only planned the entire stay, she had already coordinated arrival times, assigned the master bedroom to my cousin's family, and labeled the guest suite for my Aunt Denise as if she had walked through the villa herself and decided who belonged where. It was not confusion. It was certainty. That was what unsettled me most. I walked upstairs to my home office, my footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor, and opened my laptop. I checked the booking calendar for the villa, expecting to see some misunderstanding or shared reservation system error. There was nothing. The property was entirely clear. No bookings. No invitations. No record of any group stay. And yet my mother had already told 15 people to pack their bags. I leaned back in my chair and pressed my fingers against my forehead, trying to make sense of the logic behind it. Patricia Harlow had always been confident, but confidence was not the same as authority. Somewhere along the way, she had crossed a line in her mind where asking became unnecessary. I opened my messages and saw her name again at the top. Another text had come in while I was checking the calendar. It read, "I hope you are not upset. Famyly is just excited. Joe always said the villa should bring everyone together." I stared at the words for a long moment. That was the pattern I had grown up with. Rewriting intent after the fact. Turning boundaries into suggestions. I remembered being 22, still living in my first apartment, when she had given my address to relatives without asking me. Back then, it had seemed small. Inconvenient, but harmless. People had shown up unannounced with food containers and expectations, treating my space like an extension of her hospitality. I had laughed it off at the time. I had always laughed things off. I closed the laptop and walked back downstairs, feeling a pressure in my chest that was not quite anger yet, but something building beneath it. The villa had been my first major purchase after years of working overtime in a downtown accounting firm in Chicago, saving aggressively while others took vacations I could not afford. I had chosen every detail of that house myself, from the wide windows facing the Atlantic to the open kitchen where I had once imagined quiet mornings alone. It was not just property. It was proof of independence. And now that independence had been quietly reassigned in my mother's mind, I picked up my phone again and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright, almost cheerful, as if nothing unusual had happened. She did not wait for me to speak. She started talking immediately about how perfect the timing was and how everyone really needed this trip. I listened without interrupting, letting her words fill the space between us. When she finally paused, I asked her calmly if she had informed anyone before checking with me. There was a short silence on the line, not surprised silence, but calculating silence, as if she were deciding how to frame something already decided. Then she said, very simply, that she had assumed I would not mind because the villa was sitting empty most of the time anyway. I looked toward the window again, where the ocean continued moving without concern for any of this. Empty. That word stayed with me longer than anything else she had said. Not because it was true, but because of how easily she had used it as justification. He ended the call shortly after, without argument, without explanation, and set the phone down on the counter. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something had already begun moving through it that I had not invited. And for the first time, I did not try to dismiss the feeling. I simply stood there, watching the reflection of the room in the darkened glass, and understood that this was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about what she believed she had the right to take without asking. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to settle into rest. The message from my mother was still there in my thoughts, repeating itself in fragments that did not fade. Joe always said the villa should bring everyone together. That sentence had a way of pretending history supported it. He sat at the edge of my bed for a moment, listening to the quiet of my house, noticing how even silence can feel different once trust has been disrupted. By the time I made coffee and walked into my home office, I already knew I would not be able to ignore this. He opened my laptop again and began searching for anything that could explain how this situation had escalated without my knowledge. It did not take long before I found it. I group message thread. Not from my account. Not from my invitation list. But from my mother. She had created a separate group chat titled Bennett Family Beach Retreat. My name was not included as an administrator. It was not included in any decision-making role at all. I scrolled through the messages slowly, my coffee growing cold beside me. There were confirmations from relatives. Excitement. Questions about flight arrivals into Daytona Beach International Airport. Someone even asked if I had a boat they could use during the stay, and my mother replied casually, "Laura will handle everything when you arrive." There it was again. My life being assigned to me without my input. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, trying to understand when this narrative had shifted from request to assumption. My villa had become the center of a plan I had never agreed to, and yet everyone involved seemed to believe my participation was already guaranteed. I closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen, placing my hands on the counter as if grounding myself physically would help clarify what my mind was still struggling to process. I thought about the years I had spent building boundaries that were simple but necessary. Not because I disliked my family, but because I had learned that kindness without limits eventually stops being kindness and becomes obligation. My mother had never fully accepted the distinction. Though here, a family asset was never truly individual. It was collective by default, regardless of whose name was on the deed or whose income had paid the mortgage. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was my Aunt Denise. Her voice was cheerful, almost excited, asking about check-in instructions and whether the guest rooms had been assigned yet. He paused before responding and asked her what she meant by assigned. There was a brief laugh on the other end, as if the question itself was unnecessary. She said my mother had already organized everything and that I was so generous to open my home like this. He did not correct her immediately. Instead, I asked her when she had received the invitation. She told me it came 2 days earlier, complete with a welcome note from my mother explaining how Laura insisted on hosting a proper family gathering. He ended the call shortly after, not because I was angry, but because I needed to understand the scale of what had already been set in motion. By mid-afternoon, I drove to a quiet parking lot near the marina, somewhere I could think without interruption. He sat in my car for a long time, watching boats move slowly across the water, each one operating within its own defined space, never assuming access to another vessel without permission. It struck me then how simple that principle was in the world outside my family. Boundaries were normal everywhere except where mine existed. He opened my phone and reviewed the villa ownership records again, as if repetition could reinforce reality against perception. The documents were unchanged. My name was still the only one listed. Yet in every conversation, in every message, in every assumption being made, that fact seemed irrelevant to everyone else. He finally understood what was happening, not as confusion, but as reinterpretation. My mother had not asked because in her mind, asking implied the possibility of refusal, and refusal was not a category she was willing to accept. He started the car but did not drive right away. Instead, I sat there, hands resting on the wheel, feeling a quiet clarity settle in. This was no longer about correcting a misunderstanding. It was about deciding whether I would allow someone else's version of access to override my reality. And for the first time, I did not feel uncertain about the answer. By the time I returned home from the marina, the feeling in my chest had changed again. It was no longer just disbelief or confusion. It was something more structured, like clarity forming around a problem that could no longer be ignored. He walked into the kitchen and saw my phone lighting up repeatedly on the counter. 5 missed calls from my mother. 3 from my Aunt Denise. 1 from a number I did not recognize, which I assumed was another relative trying to confirm plans that were never actually theirs to confirm. He let the phone ring again as it started vibrating in my hand. This time I answered. My mother's voice came through immediately, sharp with familiarity, as if she had been speaking to me the entire time and I had simply stopped listening. She asked if I had seen the group messages and said people were already booking flights based on the schedule she had shared. There was no question in her tone, only expectation. He asked her calmly why she had told everyone I was hosting them. There was a pause, brief but deliberate, like she was deciding how to reframe reality in real time. Then she said she had only organized things to help because I was always busy and the villa was sitting unused. The phrase sitting unused landed differently this time. It was no longer just a justification. It was a claim. He walked slowly into the living room, looking out at the ocean again, trying to separate what I owned from what others believed they could assign to me. He reminded her that ownership was not the same as availability. She responded with a light laugh, telling me I was being too formal about something that was clearly a family tradition in the making. That was when I realized she was not negotiating. She was already committed to a version of events where my consent was irrelevant. After I ended the call, I sat down and opened the property management account for the villa. There were already external bookings attempted through a third-party service using my address, flagged but not completed. Someone had been actively trying to operationalize her plan beyond conversation. That detail made everything feel less abstract. This was no longer just assumptions being made within the family. It was action being taken based on those assumptions. He leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking about how easily narrative becomes permission when no one challenges it early enough. Later that evening, I called my cousin Mark, someone who had always been slightly more removed from my mother's influence. He asked him what he knew about the upcoming trip. He hesitated before speaking, then said he thought I had already agreed because my mother had mentioned I was very excited to bring everyone together after so long. He even mentioned that some relatives were planning to bring gifts for the villa as a thank you for hosting. He closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but because I could see the full structure of misunderstanding now. It was layered, reinforced, repeated across multiple conversations until it began to feel like truth to people who had never asked me directly. After the call, I walked through the house slowly, checking each room, not because anything was wrong physically, but because I needed to feel the difference between my space and the version of it being constructed in other people's minds. The villa in Florida had always been a private decision, a space built from years of discipline and independence. Yet in less than a week, it had been rewritten into something communal without any input from its owner. I stopped in front of the window again, watching the last light fade over the water, and understood something that felt both simple and final. This was not about a misunderstanding that could be corrected with explanation. It was about whether I would allow my life to be narrated by someone who had already decided I would not object. The following morning arrived with a strange kind of stillness, the kind that feels temporary, like the air before a storm that has already been scheduled. I woke up before sunrise again, not because I wanted to, but because my mind had started working through patterns I could no longer ignore. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, reviewing everything again from the beginning. The group messages, the confirmations, the assumptions. Each piece alone felt small, but together they formed something structured and intentional. My mother had not simply suggested a gathering. She had already built an entire reality around it. As I sat there, I received another notification. This time it was from the booking system associated with the villa. A cleaning service had been requested for the day before the supposed arrival of guests. The request had been submitted using my contact information but authorized through a secondary email I did not recognize. That was the moment something inside me shifted from observation to action. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet neighborhood beyond. Everything looked normal. That was the most unsettling part. Nothing on the surface reflected what was happening underneath it. I returned to my laptop and began tracing every digital footprint connected to the villa, not in a frantic way, but with a calm precision that surprised even me. Over the years, I had learned how to manage systems, contracts, and accounts, but I had never applied that same level of attention to my own family dynamics. Now I was. By late morning, I found what I had been looking for. My mother had contacted a local event coordinator 2 weeks earlier, presenting herself as the organizer of a private family retreat. She had used my villa address, my photos, and even my name in communication threads with vendors. There were catering quotes, rental arrangements, and even a tentative guest itinerary, all built on the assumption that she had authority she did not possess. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen without blinking for several seconds. It was not just miscommunication anymore. It was infrastructure. A full plan constructed around a version of reality where I would simply comply. I closed the laptop and exhaled slowly, then picked up my phone and called her again. She answered quickly, almost as if she had been waiting. Her tone was lighter this time, almost satisfied, as if things were already falling into place. She asked if I had resolved my concerns and reminded me that people were very excited. I interrupted her calmly and told her I had seen the arrangements with the event coordinator. There was a brief pause, shorter than before, but heavier. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same confidence, but with a slight edge of impatience. She said she had only helped organize the details because I had been overwhelmed lately in it. Mother sense to delegate. He asked her directly if she understood that she had confirmed plans involving my property without my consent. She responded by saying I was focusing too much on technicalities instead of seeing the bigger picture, which was family coming together after a long time. He listened without responding, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to notice it. Then I told her, in the same calm tone I had used throughout, that there would be no event at the villa. The reaction was immediate. Not anger, not surprise, but disbelief, as if I had said something that contradicted a fact already accepted by everyone else. She insisted that people had already booked flights, that everything was arranged, and that canceling now would be embarrassing for the family. He stood by the window again as she spoke, watching a delivery truck pass slowly down the street. When she finished, I told her that embarrassment was not a reason to override ownership. Then I ended the call. For a long moment, I did not move. I simply stood there, holding my phone, feeling the weight of something settling into place. It was not conflict yet. It was clarity. And clarity, I realized, was always what came right before consequences. The silence after I ended the call did not last long. It was only a few minutes before my phone started lighting up again, this time with multiple messages from different relatives. He did not need to open them to understand the direction things were taking. He already knew. When I finally checked, the tone was exactly as expected. Confusion, followed by disappointment, followed by pressure disguised as concern. My cousin Mark wrote that flights had already been purchased and asked if there was a last-minute misunderstanding that could be resolved quickly. My Aunt Denise sent a voice message saying it would be heartbreaking for everyone if the trip was cancelled after so much excitement. And then there were messages from people I barely spoke to anymore, all repeating variations of the same idea, that family should be flexible, that I was overreacting, that this was supposed to be a joyful reunion. He placed the phone face down on the table. And sat still for a moment, letting the noise exist without responding to it. What struck me most was not the pressure itself, but the coordination. No one was asking what had actually happened. They were all responding to a version of reality that had already been accepted. By the time afternoon arrived, I received an email from the event coordinator directly. It was polite, formal, and completely unaware of the conflict unfolding behind it. The message confirmed final arrangements for catering, cleaning staff, and guest check-in instructions, all scheduled to begin the following Thursday. At the bottom, there was a note addressed to me specifically, thanking me for my hospitality and confirming that my mother had approved all logistics on my behalf. He stared at that sentence longer than I should have. On my behalf. The words were doing a kind of work I had not authorized. He closed the email and stood up, walking through the house again, this time noticing things I had previously ignored. The quiet corners, the empty chairs, the absence of anything that suggested my life could be easily rearranged by someone else's enthusiasm. Later that evening, I decided to drive to the villa. The drive from my home took a little under 2 hours along the coastal highway, the kind of route that normally felt calming, with wide stretches of ocean visible between palm trees and small towns. Back that day, I barely noticed the scenery. My mind was focused on one thing: what would actually happen when intention met physical space. When I arrived, the villa looked exactly as I had left it, clean, still, untouched by any of the chaos that had been constructed around it remotely. He parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The air near the ocean was warm, steady, and unfamiliar in its calmness. He walked up to the front door and unlocked it, stepping inside slowly. Everything was in place. The furniture, the kitchen, the view through the large glass doors facing the water. But now, standing in it, I could feel the difference between ownership and assumption more clearly than ever. He moved through each room, checking nothing in particular, just confirming reality with my presence. The guest rooms were empty. The dining area was untouched. Yet in my mind, I could already see the version of this space my mother had constructed, filled with people, noise, and expectations that did not belong here. My phone rang again while I was standing in the living room. It was her. He answered. Her voice was different this time. Less casual. More controlled. She asked if I had reconsidered, saying people were already excited and that canceling now would cause unnecessary conflict. He looked out at the ocean through the glass doors before responding. He told her I was inside the villa and that there would be no guests arriving. There was a pause on the line. A longer one this time. When she spoke again, her tone shifted slightly, carrying something closer to frustration. She said I was being rigid, that I was turning something joyful into something difficult. I listened carefully, then told her that joy does not require permission taken from someone else's property. The line went quiet again. Distime, the silence was not neutral. It had weight. He could hear faint background noise on her end, voices perhaps, as if she was not alone when she called. She told me people were counting on this, that plans had already been made. He looked around the empty villa and realized how easily she had filled it with expectations that were never mine to carry. Then I said calmly that expectations do not override consent. After that, I ended the call. He did not feel anger when I put the phone down. What I felt was something more final, like a line that had been drawn clearly enough that even denial could no longer blur it. Outside, the ocean continued moving as it always had, indifferent to every assumption made about the space in front of it. The following morning began with a series of messages that confirmed what I already suspected would happen next. The tone had shifted from persuasion to expectation. My mother was no longer asking me to reconsider. She was now informing me of how disappointing it would be for everyone if I continued to stand in the way of something already in motion. There were messages from relatives attaching. Iraible times again, as if repetition could overwrite reality. One even included a screenshot of flight confirmation into Daytona Beach International Airport with a note saying, "See you soon at the villa." He placed the phone on the counter without replying and poured myself a glass of water, watching my reflection in the kitchen window as I tried to understand how quickly assumption had turned into coordination. By midday, I decided to take a step that I had been delaying. He contacted the event coordinator directly. I introduced myself, clarified my ownership of the property, and asked for a full record of all communications related to the so-called family retreat. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before the coordinator responded with professional politeness, explaining that all arrangements had been made through my mother, who had presented herself as the primary organizer. He asked a simple question: did she ever provide proof of ownership or authorization from me? The answer was no. Everything had been accepted based on verbal representation and the assumption of family consent. He ended the call shortly after, thanking them for their time, but inside I felt something settle more firmly into place. This was no longer just family misunderstanding. It was a chain of decisions built entirely on assumption. He sat at my desk for a long time after that call, reviewing every layer of communication again. What became clear was not just that my mother had acted without permission, but that she had framed my silence as agreement. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Silence was not consent. Silence was simply absence of conflict, and she had mistaken that absence for approval. In the afternoon, I received another call from my Aunt Denise. This time her tone was less cheerful. She asked directly if there was any chance I could let this go forward for the sake of peace. She said people were already emotionally invested, that some had even taken time off work, and that canceling now would damage family trust. He listened quietly and then asked her one question in return. He asked her if she had ever confirmed with me directly that I agreed to host anyone. There was a hesitation on the line that lasted longer than comfortable. She admitted she had not, but insisted that my mother had spoken with such confidence that it felt official. That word stayed with me after the call ended. Oficial. As if confidence alone could replace authorization. As evening approached, I drove back to the villa again. The second visit felt different from the first. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was no longer observing the space as a passive owner. He was now assessing it as a system that had been misinterpreted by others. He walked through each room slowly, noticing how easily it could accommodate the scenario my mother had imagined. 15 people would fit comfortably. The dining area could support shared meals. The guest rooms could be assigned without difficulty. In that sense, her plan was not unrealistic. It was simply unauthorized. I stood in the center of the living room and looked out at the ocean again, thinking about how often people confuse capacity with permission. Just because something can hold others does not mean it belongs to them. My phone rang once more while I was there. It was my mother again. He answered but did not speak immediately. She did not waste time with greetings. She said people were starting to ask questions and that I needed to be reasonable before things escalated unnecessarily. He asked her calmly what she believed would happen if I did not change my position. She said it would create embarrassment, tension, and long-lasting resentment. He nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, and then I told her that all of those outcomes were consequences of decisions already made without my agreement. There was another silence, but this one felt different. Less controlled. More uncertain. She tried again, saying I was overcomplicating something that was meant to be simple family togetherness. He looked at the empty space around me and replied that togetherness requires consent from all participants, not just intention from one side. The call ended shortly after without resolution. He remained standing in the same spot for a long time after the screen went dark, listening to the quiet rhythm of the ocean beyond the glass. Nothing in the villa had changed, but everything around it had already begun to shift in ways that could not be undone by expectation alone. The morning of what was supposed to be the arrival day began with a silence that felt heavier than usual. There were no new messages when I first checked my phone, and for a brief moment I wondered if something had finally paused the momentum of assumptions that had been building for days. But that thought lasted only a few seconds. By mid-morning, the notifications began again, this time more urgent, more clustered, as if multiple people had decided at once that I was now responsible for solving a problem I did not create. My mother called twice in a row. He did not answer immediately. When I finally did, Her voice carried a different tone, less confident than before, but still holding on to control. She said people were already on their way, that some had boarded flights, and that I needed to step in and confirm everything. He asked her what exactly she expected me to confirm. There was a pause, and then she said simply that I should open the villa and let the family proceed as planned. He stood in my kitchen while she spoke, looking out at the familiar view of the street beyond, trying to process how the conversation had shifted so far from reality. He reminded her that no agreement had ever been given. She responded by saying that agreement had been implied through family understanding, as if that phrase carried legal weight. He told her calmly that implication does not override ownership. She did not respond immediately. Instead, I could hear faint background noise, other voices, as if she was not alone in this conversation. Then she said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. She said I was making this more difficult than it needed to be, and that if I simply cooperated, everything would feel normal again. After I ended the call, I sat at the table for a long time without moving. It was not anger I felt, and it was not confusion anymore. It was recognition. The situation was no longer about persuasion or misunderstanding. It had become an expectation reinforced by repetition. Every relative, every message, every assumption had built a structure where my refusal felt abnormal to everyone except me. Around noon, I drove again to the villa, this time without hesitation. The road along the coast was bright and clear, the ocean visible in long stretches between palm trees and open sky. But I did not feel the usual calm that the drive used to bring. Instead, I felt a kind of steady focus, as if I was approaching something that had already been decided internally but not yet externally enforced. When I arrived, I noticed immediately that something had changed. A small package had been left near the front entrance. It contained printed schedules, labeled arrival instructions, and a welcome note addressed to all family guests, complete with my villa address at the top. My name was written at the bottom as the host. He stood there for a moment holding the papers, feeling the weight of how far the assumption had already traveled beyond conversation. He walked inside and placed the documents on the table, then moved through the villa slowly, room by room, not out of doubt but out of confirmation. Everything was still mine, yet everything had been spoken about as if it was already shared. Later that afternoon, I received a message from my cousin Mark. He said he had just landed in Florida and was heading toward the villa with 2 other relatives. He added that everyone was excited to finally see the place I had so generously opened. He read the message twice, then set the phone down. There was no confusion in it, only arrival. He looked out through the glass doors at the ocean again, noticing how unchanged it remained regardless of what had been decided elsewhere. For the first time, I understood that the situation was no longer waiting for clarification. It was waiting for contact. And that realization brought with it a quiet certainty that whatever happened next would no longer exist in the space of discussion. The first sign that everything had crossed into reality came when my phone started ringing repeatedly with numbers I did not recognize. He was still standing inside the villa when the calls began, each one stacking urgency onto the last. He answered the 4th call, and the voice on the other end introduced herself as a rideshare driver asking for clarification about a drop-off location. She said she was arriving with a group of passengers who had provided my villa address as their destination. Before I could respond, she added that there were at least 6 people in her vehicle and more following behind in separate cars. He stepped closer to the window and looked outside. The driveway was still empty, but the meaning of empty had changed. It was no longer peace. It was timing. He asked her to wait and ended the call, then immediately contacted the property gate management system to confirm access protocols. While I was doing that, another notification came through, this time from my cousin Mark. They said they had arrived at the neighborhood entrance and were confused because the gate code they were given did not work. It added that my mother had assured them someone would meet them at the villa to let them in. I placed the phone down slowly on the counter and took a moment to breathe, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was now fully aware that multiple independent systems were acting on the same incorrect assumption. I walked to the front door and stood there, looking out at the road. Within minutes, I saw the first vehicle approach. Tenanoter. Tenanoter. 3 cars pulled up near the entrance area, not rushing, not chaotic, but expectant, as if arrival guaranteed access. I remained inside the villa without moving. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I answered but did not speak first. She asked if I could please open the gate and stop making this dramatic. Her tone was sharper now, less controlled than before. I told her the situation was no longer about emotion or drama. It was about unauthorized arrival. She responded immediately, saying I was humiliating the family by refusing to cooperate when people had already traveled long distances. I looked through the glass doors at the cars outside and said calmly that travel does not create permission. There was silence on the line. Not long, but heavy enough to signal that the narrative she had built was no longer holding steady under real conditions. She then said something different. She said I was hurting people who had done nothing wrong, and that I was turning a simple family gathering into a confrontation. I told her again that no gathering had ever been agreed to by me. After that, I ended the call. I could see movement now. People stepping out of cars, looking toward the villa, checking phones, making calls of their own. I did not go outside. I stayed inside the living room, watching through the glass as expectation met absence. Another call came in, this time from my Aunt Denise. Her voice was softer, more uncertain. She asked if there had been a mistake with the address. I told her there was no mistake. The address was correct. The assumption was not. She did not respond immediately. I could hear faint background noise, other voices discussing confusion, asking what was happening. Then she said that people were upset because they thought I would be waiting for them. I looked at the ocean beyond the property line and said that waiting implies agreement, and agreement had never been given. When I ended that call, I noticed something that made everything feel final in a different way. The group messages had stopped updating. The coordination that had been so active for days had reached a point where no new instructions could replace what was now physically happening. I walked slowly through the villa again, not to check anything, but to confirm my position within it. The space had not changed, but its meaning had. It was no longer a shared expectation. It was a defined boundary. The cars remained parked. People were still there, still arriving, still trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they were now experiencing. I stood by the window, watching without movement, and understood clearly that this moment was no longer about stopping anything. It was about allowing reality to replace assumption.